What accident? The farmer asked. Mrs. Grimm frowned. What accident? Mrs. Appleby exclaimed. Thomas, the house has been destroyed. I found you lying in the field unconscious. You don't remember? I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing wrong with the house, Mr. Appleby argued. Oh dear, the painkillers are really doing a number on him, Mrs. Appleby said, shifting in her seat to face them. Mrs. Grimm, I don't think my husband is up to talking right now. I understand. Perhaps you might have a moment to spare us, then? Of course. Mrs. Appleby gestured for them to follow her into the hallway. So sorry to trouble you, Mrs. Grimm said to the farmer as they walked toward the door. I do hope you feel better soon, Mr. Appleby. Daphne stopped and turned to the injured man. I like my outfit, she said, and stuck her tongue out. Mr. Appleby stuck his tongue out too, and the little girl stomped out of the room. He's acting very odd right now, Mrs. Appleby said when they were in the hallway. I'm considering taking him out of this hospital. Oh, I'm sure he's in good hands. So you said he was raving about something, Mrs. Grimm prompted. It's silly. He swore he'd seen. Well, this is crazy, but he said he'd seen a giant. He did? Sabrina gasped. Wouldn't that be a sight? Mrs. Grimm chuckled. But I have a different theory about what happened, Mrs. Appleby explained. There was a man who came out to the farm several times, asking us if we would rent the place to him for a night. He said he was making a movie or something, and was very friendly at first, but when Thomas refused, he got quite nasty. How unfortunate. Has he come back? Mrs. Grimm asked. Well, that's just it. A week later he did come back and apologized for being so rude. He said he wanted to make it up to us, so he booked us into a fancy hotel in New York City, all expenses paid, with tickets to a Broadway show. I haven't had a vacation in years. Farming is a tough business, so I was thrilled. How nice. Did you enjoy your vacation? Not at all. When I got there, I found that the hotel didn't have any record of our reservation, and the tickets to the show were counterfeit, Mrs. Appleby said angrily. I should have stayed home with Thomas. Didn't your husband go with you? Mrs. Grimm asked. Oh no, he doesn't care for the city much, Mrs. Appleby sighed. I took my sister. We had to use our own money for a hotel, and the only place with a room was infested with bedbugs. How dreadful, Mrs. Grimm sympathized. Mrs. Appleby, this man's name didn't happen to be Charming, did it? Oh no, it was Englishman, the woman replied, sniffing. I remember, because Thomas said he had one of those funny accents, one of those accidents they have over there. I thought it was a funny coincidence. You know, his last name and the accent. What did this Mr. Englishman look like? I'm sorry, I never saw him. Thomas had all the dealings with him. Mrs. Appleby, I'm sure you want to get back to your husband, but I have one last question. Do either of you own a video camera? Mrs. Grimm took a clean handkerchief out of her handbag and offered it to the woman. Sabrina noticed a soft pink powder fell from it as the woman wiped her eyes. It was the same color as the stuff Glinda had dumped all over the farmer. No, no, Mr. Appleby is a little tight with the money, if you know what I mean. Suddenly, Sabrina noticed a change in the woman's face. It seemed to wipe itself of all emotion, and her eyes drifted into a blank stare. What were you saying? She asked in a distant voice. I hear you had a wonderful time in New York City, Mrs. Grimm said. The musical was the best thing you have ever experienced. Okay, Mrs. Appleby said. Then she turned and went into her husband's room without saying goodbye. Mrs. Grimm pulled her notebook out of her handbag and scribbled away. So the plot thickens. More proof of a giant. That man is full of medications. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There's no such thing as giants, Sabrina said, a bit louder than she meant to. The declaration echoed down the hospital hallway. Sabrina! Daphne shouted. Listen, I don't know where you live, but my sister and I are here on Earth, where things can easily be explained without having to consider giants, Sabrina said in a much lower tone. This Mr. Englishman wanted to rent the farm to make a movie. When the farmer wouldn't agree, he tried to trick them into leaving town so he could do it when they weren't around. Something went wrong on the set and he accidentally blew the place up. Charming has an English accent. He's Englishman. Sabrina, I'm proud of you, Mrs. Grimm said as she led them into the elevator. You have incredible skills of deduction. You looked at the clues and chose the most likely path to solve the crime. You're going to make a great detective, but your theory only raises more questions. First, Charming isn't a filmmaker. Why would he want to videotape the farm? Second, what about the giant footprint? Maybe Charming is making a campaign commercial. He is the mayor after all. And as for the house, maybe it was a gas leak. Buildings blow up all the time in New York because someone left the stove burning. Brilliant! The town does have an election in the near future, so the campaign commercial is worth considering, and a gas leak is a valid theory. Still, there's one loose end. When things blow up, pieces fly. When things blow up, pieces fly everywhere. Applebee's house is all in a pile, like it was squashed from above, Mrs. Grimm pointed out. The elevator stopped, and the Grimm stepped into the busy emergency lobby. I agree with Granny. The house was stomped on, Daphne said. Sabrina shot her an angry look. And I think I know who is responsible, said Mrs. Grimm. Really? Who? Daphne squealed. I think you'll enjoy it more if it's a surprise. Excuse me, ladies, a voice said as three men emerged from the deep shadows that lined the pathway to the parking lot. They were the same men in suits who had watched them when they entered the hospital. The small and dumpy one had a crowbar he kept smacking into his gloved hand. The men on either side of him stood like huge muscle-bound bookends their much shorter leader. One glance told Sabrina the men were trouble. We hear you've been asking some questions about a certain farm, the deputy leader continued. Then you've heard correctly, Mrs. Grimm said as she placed herself squarely between the girls and the thugs. Daphne grabbed her sister's hand and squeezed tightly, but Sabrina hardly noticed. She was too awestruck by the old woman's courage. Just a friendly warning, Rhoda. If you know what's good for you, you'll just forget about the whole thing, the leader said with a dark smile. If I knew what was good for me, I wouldn't be in this line of work, Mrs. Grimm replied. I seem to be at a disadvantage, young man. You know my name, but I don't know yours. Or better yet, who the unfortunate employer is who hired the likes of you three. Tell him he should know it takes more than 3 goons to scare me. Now, good night. She tried to pass the man, but as she did, the leader grabbed her arm and pulled her close to his face. Some people can't take a hint, he barked. Young man, if you don't let us pass, you are going to regret it, Mrs. Grimm said. Sabrina's heart began to pound. How could Mrs. Grimm be so calm? These men were about to tear her apart. Is that so? The head goon growled. The old woman pulled a little silver whistle from around her neck and blew into it. No sound could be heard. It was broken. When she put it back inside her dress, she smiled. Yes, that's so. Chapter 4. Leave my grandmother alone, Daphne commanded. Before Sabrina could stop her, the little girl had rushed forward and kicked the dumpy man in the shin. He cried out in pain and clutched his leg. Then Mrs. Grimm hit him on top of his head with her heavy book-filled handbag, and he crumpled to the ground, groaning. Seeing how easily the leader had fallen to a little girl and an old lady, the 2 other thugs laughed. What are you laughing at? The old little leader snapped as he crawled to his feet. Sorry, Tony, one of the goons said. Have you lost your mind? Tony bellowed. What? The goon asked defensively. You told her my name. We all agreed we were going to keep our identity secret. The goon shrugged. Sorry, Tony. I didn't think. Steve, you just did it again, the other thug pointed out. Shut up, Bobby. Both of you shut up, shouted Tony. Why don't you idiots just give them our addresses and phone numbers too? Who cares, Steve said. Because they can identify us to the cops, Tony complained as he turned his attention back to Mrs. Grimm. He raised his heavy crowbar above his head and snarled. Now we have to do something drastic. Easier said than done, the voice came from behind them. Sabrina and Daphne turned to see Mr. Canis emerge from the shadows with Elvis close behind. Steve laughed. Look out, here comes your boyfriend. I'll make you an offer. If you run off now, no one will get hurt, Canis said. His voice was cold and hard, but the thugs just chuckled. Even Sabrina could tell that frail old Mr. Canis wasn't going to be able to stop three thugs. He hardly looked strong enough to hold up the clothes he was wearing. No, the group was in big trouble. It was up to her. Sabrina searched around her for a weapon, a rock, a stick, anything she could use to fight the man. Unfortunately, the pathway was as clean of debris as it was of people. Girls, get behind Elvis, please, Mr. Canis said, taking their hands and pulling them back so that the Great Dane was between them and trouble. Enough of this! Get him! Tony ordered, and Bobby and Steve lunged at Mr. Canis. Sabrina was sure they had seen the last of the old man, but he had caught both of the goons by the throat, one in each hand, and lifted them off the ground, holding them aloft as their feet dangled and kicked. Even more shocking was the loud, guttural growl the old man released when he tossed the thugs across the cold concrete ground. For 10 yards they thumped and bounced, groaning with each painful smack against the pavement. All right, if that's the way you want to play it, Tony threatened. He pushed Mrs. Grimm roughly to the ground and swung his iron bar wildly at Mr. Canis, but Old Man quickly stepped sideways and tripped him. He crashed to the pavement with his friends. Sabrina could hardly believe how agile the old man was, especially when Tony leaped up and rushed at him again with the same painful result. She was doubly surprised. Hurry, girls, we should get to safety, Mrs. Grimm said as she got up and led them away from the fight. Elvis trotted along beside them, barking warnings at the goons not to follow. When they got to the car, Daphne climbed in, and anxiously peered out the windows. After several minutes, Mr. Canis was still not back. We shouldn't have left him, Daphne said. There were 3 of them. Granny, he can't fight them all. Tears were running down her cheeks. Before Mrs. Grimm could calm her down, the car door opened and Mr. Canis crawled in behind the wheel. He was completely unharmed and wearing a little grin on his face. See, Liebling, he's just fine, the old woman said. She turned to Mr. Canis. The girls will worry about you. The old man turned in his seat and looked back at Sabrina and Daphne. He was the same painfully thin, watery-eyed old self. Daphne leaned forward and planted a kiss on his cheek. His face turned red with embarrassment. Don't you ever do that again, she commanded, and she hugged him tightly and then sat back into her seat. Mr. Canis nodded in agreement. I, for one, am thrilled at what's transpiring, Mrs. Grimm said, taking out her notepad and pen. She began jotting notes frantically. Sabrina was shocked. Thrilled? We were almost killed. Killed? Oh, Mr. Canis, doesn't she remind you of Basil? Mrs. Grimm tittered. Mr. Canis nodded. No, I think we have cause to celebrate, the older woman continued. Why? Did you find a clue? Daphne asked. No, not at all. Then what's to celebrate? Sabrina asked. We're getting close to solving this case, Lieblings. When they send the goons, the bad guys are getting nervous. So what now? Daphne asked. We'll follow those hooligans back to their hideout. What? Why would we do that? Sabrina cried, remembering Tony and his crowbar. Because they're going to lead us right back to their boss. Ladies, we're going on a stakeout. Mr. Canis rolled down his window, stuck his head out into the cool night air, and put the car into gear. He seemed to instinctively know how to find the thug's car. He trailed them at a distance, which is pretty great considering the noise coming from Mrs. Grimm's old rust bucket. Driving high into the hills overlooking Ferryport Landing, they passed no other cars, just a few deer that darted into the forest as soon as the headlights hit them. But Sabrina was in no mood to enjoy the scenery. Mrs. Grimm's sanity seemed to slip. Seems like my time's up. Lesson 1.